When I first moved to Germany, I did what I thought you were supposed to do. I enrolled straight into an intensive German course. 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. It was seriously intense, to say the least. And from the very first lesson, it felt less like learning a language and more like studying some sort of science. We weren't really speaking much, we were deconstructing. We were memorizing the cases, diagramming sentence structures, trying to understand why die suddenly became der and der became dem halfway through a sentence, depending on which preposition you used. Like, ich gehe in die Stadt, but ich bin in der Stadt. Ich fliege über die Stadt, ich fahre unter der Stadt. Ich lege das Buch auf den Tisch versus das Buch liegt auf dem Tisch. Like, why does die become der and der become dem? Gender gets pretty confusing pretty quickly in German now. There are logical, rules, there are grammatical rules which explain this, but the point is you can memorize all of these rules in the classroom. But when it actually comes to speaking, it's much more about what feels right rather than trying to remember the correct grammatical table. So I kind of kept waiting for this moment when it would all just click, when the patterns would start making sense, but they never really did. Because language doesn't really work like that. You can't solve it the way you would solve an equation. Well, maybe some people can, but that just didn't work for me. So if I had to learn German again, I'd still study the rules, but I'd study them differently. Not as laws to memorize, but more as like a rhythm to feel. Now, I know it sounds really cheesy, but the best analogy I can find is to learn grammar is the way a musician learns chords. So from the ages of 9 to 15, I learned to play the piano. And when I first sat down at the piano, I didn't start by analyzing music theory or reading notation for 6 months. I just sort of put my hands on the keys and listened to how the sounds felt. I let my fingers start to remember the patterns. It was much more physical than it was intellectual. And I think that's a much better way to learn grammar. You listen, you repeat, you play with the sounds until it becomes intuitive. And if you start with this approach, it can become intuitive relatively quickly. You don't really necessarily think about why it's right. You just know when it sounds off. The structure moves from your head into your body. And once that happens, you start to speak much more fluidly, even if you're not using perfect grammar, because that's not really the point anyway. It can be really fun and like a great intellectual exercise to try and translate certain words or phrases into your native language. But at some point, that really becomes counterproductive and it's also just unnatural. So I would stop trying to translate things and really start learning through context and intuition. But having said all that, this way of learning really is based on a very important prerequisite, which is that you can only learn this way if you are willing and able to make a lot of mistakes. Because feeling the rhythm means you have to actually play it out, and not just in your head. You have to play it out loud in front of people, with other people. And you have to be open to being corrected. And that's really when many people freeze and they retract and they stop trying. It's one thing to understand linguistic rules. It's another to open your mouth and risk getting it wrong in public. And failure without judgment really is the quickest way to learn, and more often than not, we judge ourselves way more than anyone else ever does. I remember back to when I first started, every time I tried to say something in those early months, I would try to see the cases in my head and sort of think, is it der, is it die, dem, den? And the moment was just sort of, it just went. The conversation moved on, or the other person got very frustrated and started trying to prompt me on what I was trying to say, and so I just often got stuck in my head, and if I couldn't formulate it clearly in my head, I just wouldn't say it at all, and so I stayed quiet. And it might sound obvious, and yet most people struggle to overcome the fact that the real enemy of fluency, it's not grammar or structure or habits or productivity. It's not some sort of study routine. It's really about ego, the need to sound smart, to be heard and understood. This need to be perfect. The fear of looking stupid stops more people from learning languages than any lack of discipline or habit development ever could. And so if I had to do it again, I'd embrace the embarrassment, because it's those awkward, like broken conversations where you stumble, laugh, and somehow still make yourself understood. That's where fluency is actually born. Every cringe-worthy moment is a step forward, and so maybe if you're not cringing at yourself, you're not learning fast enough. Another point that I would do differently is to stop this obsession with discipline. Now, so the obvious goal with foreign language learning is fluency. You will often see these ridiculous claims like achieve fluency in 30 days. But fluency is a moving target. There's always more to learn. There's new words, new phrases, new ways of self-expression. And so if I had to learn German again, I wouldn't brute force it. I would work on trying to enjoy the process as much as possible. There are all these phrases in German like aller Anfang ist schwer, or Übung macht den Meister, or vom nix kommt nix, Morgenstund hat Gold in Mund, ohne Preis kein Fleiß, etc., etc. There are literally hundreds of these kind of phrases, and I mean, we have them in English as well. But the point being that, yes, some hard work is necessary, but ticking off lessons, following rigid study routines or obsessing over consistency and language learning streaks, that can be very counterproductive very quickly because it's not something to be learned in theory. Language is something you learn through living in practice and reality, and ideally it grows in the background of your day, in the music you listen to, in the films you sort of half understand, the overheard conversations. That's really what makes you learn and sort of piques your curiosity. It's in those little stories or the podcasts you listen to. When you only ever study in like set blocks of time, language stays in a box. It becomes this thing you have to do. But when you start weaving it into your life, when it becomes part of your entertainment, part of your curiosity and your routine, that's when it stops feeling forced and becomes way more natural. I made the most progress not in the classroom, but in everyday situations, like through misunderstandings at work, or hearing the same phrases repeated over and over and over again, like the announcements on the subway, Ausstieg in Fahrtrichtung rechts, or the phrases in restaurants like geht das zusammen oder getrennt. This didn't really feel like study or work, it just felt like life. And if you're not living in Germany, or even if you are, but your work life is in English, one of the best ways to simulate this environment is with LingoPie, who have now been a sponsor of this channel for almost a year. It turns out that immersion is something you can now choose. LingoPie offers a massive selection of shows and films with the ability to make use of incredible language learning tools. You can turn on German or English or both at the same time. Whenever you hit a word you don't understand, just click it. There's an instant translation and it's saved to your vocab list so you can review it later for further study. What I like most is how flexible LingoPie is. You can slow down the audio when needed, you can follow along with the full transcript on the side, and if there's a sentence that's tricky, you can just loop it until it clicks. LingoPie has over 3,000 native shows and movies, and this is the tool I wish had existed when I started learning German all those years ago. So whether you're living in Germany or not, this is the perfect way to gain exposure to the language, to get accustomed to different accents, expand your vocabulary, and build up your personal bank of common phrases. Oh, and just in case German isn't enough for you, you will have access to 13 more languages with LingoPie, including French, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Italian, and they've just added Polish, Hebrew, and Greek. Click the link in the description below to start your 7-day free trial today. My link also gets you an exclusive discount once inside. Now, another key point that I do differently is to place less focus on metrics. When I first started learning German, I measured everything, like how many words I'd memorized, how many minutes I'd studied, and all the sentence drills I'd completed. It gave me something to hold on to, and in today's world, this is how we measure progress. It's why every app has a huge amount of analytics with numbers and graphs and winning streaks to achieve. And the problem with this is the brain does not learn through repetition alone. You can memorize 100 words a day, but if there's no meaning baked into them, you'll have forgotten most of them within a week. The brain prioritizes that which carries emotional weight. And so that's why you can remember the melody of a song you once heard on the radio 10 years ago, but you forget the 10 new words you memorized yesterday. Or why, if you made some sort of embarrassing linguistic mistake that caused everyone to laugh at you, you'll never make that mistake again, because emotion sears lessons into your long-term memory, which is something that data and analytics just cannot achieve. And yet modern language learning has been built around data, the analytics, the streaks, the dashboards, the vocab list. This feels right. But if I had to learn German again, I would avoid this way of learning like the plague, because it tries to flatter our desire for certainty and safety by coddling us with this fake motivation. But what I've come to learn is that learning a foreign language is not about a performance of control. It's much more like an act of surrender, meaning you don't master it through arbitrary measurements and time blocks and Pomodoro techniques. You master it by inhabiting it, and that happens through day-to-day interaction. So like, just take the word doch, for example. Every foreigner wrestles with it. There's no translation that fully captures it. It's not quite yes, it's not quite no. It can convey contradiction, defiance, and reassurance, which, yes, seem like contradictions, but that's really because it relies on tone and context. And so you don't really learn doch from a vocab list. You learn it from hearing it in use, from experiencing the way someone says it to comfort a friend, or to push back gently, or to insist that they're right one last time. You feel it long before you understand it intellectually. And so if I had to learn German again, I'd learn fewer words, but I'd sort of learn the meaning behind them much more, meaning I would spend more time on the basic, most important terms, and understanding how they fit into a sentence at an emotional level. When I look back now, after more than a decade of speaking German, I realized I didn't just learn a language, I learned a different way of being in the world. At first it was about rules and structure, but then it became much more about rhythm and things like embarrassment and curiosity and identity, all the things you can't really teach in a classroom. And somewhere along the way, the language stopped being something I was learning and became something I was living through. And so if I had to start again, I'd worry much less about perfection and more about presence, like much less about memorizing stuff and more about meaning. Because the truth is, learning a language is not just about learning a skill, it's also about building another self, one that can see, think and feel from a slightly different angle. Sprache ist der Schlüssel zur Welt is often a quote attributed to Wilhelm von Humboldt, the 19th century linguist and philosopher. And it really speaks deeply to me because that just really shows the power of it. It's not just about communication. It's actually transformation at a fundamental level, because each new word, each clumsy sentence, each misunderstood joke, it pulls you further out of who you were and pushes you a little closer to who you're becoming. And so you never really finish learning a language. You just keep uncovering new layers of yourself within it.